All right, well, welcome back from lunch, everyone. I hope you all had a good bite to eat. I hope you all got at least a short chance to go across the hall and check out some of the really exciting research projects that are happening here at CMU around grid, AI, and other energy-related topics. I am so excited for this next session. This combines three really exciting topics, in my opinion, which is national security, AI, and the grid. And so it's my pleasure to introduce this fireside chat, Electrotech's National Security Moment, Powering AI, Securing the Grid, and Outcompeting China. We have the honor today to be joined by Mika Ouyang. She's a visiting professor at the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology. We have Jordan Henry, who serves as the director of the Cybersecurity Research Center at the National Lab of the Rockies. And then lastly, our own Harry Krejza, director of studies at Carnegie Mellon's Institute for Strategy and Technology. Harry, the fireside chat is all yours.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you all for being here today. We're really excited for this conversation. As you've heard throughout this week and today's programming, this is just a tremendous moment of dynamism in energy infrastructure, in innovation and technology in this ecosystem, and we're seeing the fundamental ways that our grid works just transform as new technologies and new ways and demand sources are driving the AI-driven demand build-out and, of course, the broader electrification of the economy overall. And that opens up a lot of opportunities to rethink our grid's approach to resilience and reliability, but also defensibility. We've heard and learned a lot in the last few years about how certain nation-state actors and non-state actors see our electrical infrastructure as a point of weakness, as a place to hold us at risk and threaten American interests. And so this is a golden opportunity, this moment of a fundamental energy transformation, to ask ourselves, what does a not only more resilient, reliable, and clean grid look like, but also a hardened one, a defensible one that can stand up to hackers and hurricanes. And we have this opportunity to get it all right and end up better than we ever could have imagined, or do it in an uncoordinated way, do it in a less than deliberate way that could leave us in not that better future timeline. And so we've got like the best couple of people to talk about that with us today. And I'm so honored to be joined by Mika and Jordan. Mika, to kick things off here, tell us about the bad news. Who are the bad guys when we talk about this issue set here, and why are they interested in our grid?
Yeah, Harry, and I'm going to be a downer here because there is a lot of bad news. And when we were planning this panel, we understood the threats to the grid and the energy that powers the AI boom in a particular way. And that was in particular because we were worried about the threat that China posed to the grid. And we had seen signs that China was very much interested in using cyber means to disrupt US critical infrastructure. For those of you who are familiar with the intrusion set called Volt Typhoon, the US and Microsoft had identified Chinese state actors on various parts of the US critical infrastructure, water, ports, things like that, that suggested an intent to disrupt life in the United States in the case of a national crisis. The expectation was that if the US were distracted at home by a lot of disruption to our critical infrastructure, we wouldn't be interested in paying attention to other parts of the world where perhaps other things are going on. However, since CMU's spring break, there's a totally different threat to the grid. And that, I think, is something that we are seeing unfolding in the Middle East right now, where you are seeing a very cyber-capable actor, Iran, also engaging in kinetic targeting against energy infrastructure, against liquefied natural gas terminals, against oil refineries, against shipping lanes, both from a cyber perspective, but also a kinetic perspective, deliberately targeting data centers and US companies engaged in use of AI to support the various combatants in the region. We are seeing a whole different level of vulnerability when it comes to energy infrastructure and what powers compute and the compute itself, that have said that perhaps these kinds of targets are fair game from a military perspective as we are trying to power our militaries with AI. So things have gotten a whole lot more complicated in the last couple weeks alone.
As if they weren't dynamic and complicated to begin with. Jordan, when Mika and I were in government together, working with you and your team, us at the Pentagon and you in the national labs, it was you and your colleagues that we looked to for the latest about how this technological ecosystem is changing. Tell us today, what are the big trends? What are the major issues you're following in this space here that it's going to animate a lot of this conversation?
Yeah, and I guess I characterize it as not just issues, but also opportunities here as well. But I mean, maybe the easiest way to look at it, and I think, I was listening into some of the talks this week, and one of the things that came up was, just this constant narrative about how fast things are changing, right? Energy has really moved at a very slow pace over the last 100 years, right, that we've actually had a grid. And the pace of change right now is just astonishing. It's just a fascinating time from a research perspective to be in energy. And some of the ways that we're characterizing this is, more operational change in the next 10 years than we've really seen in the last 100. And there's a lot that goes into that operational change. Some of the things that we're really focused on from a security perspective is, the fact that our grid and some of the energy infrastructure that connects to it means that, the wires that are taking electrons from generation to load has typically been characterized as a transmission or distribution system. And with all of the energy innovation we're seeing right now, it's really that's becoming more of an integration system. It's about new business models. It's about other stakeholders exchanging information in ways that hadn't been before. It's not just utilities, right, who are on the front lines, right, of state actors anymore. It's non-utility stakeholders, aggregators, OEMs, et cetera. And all of that, while it brings a lot of risk and uncertainty, I think from a cybersecurity perspective, even from just dollars and cents, how do we quantify that and then put money towards it, in kind of a prioritized way? But it also gets to a point to where if we do these things right, given that these things are going to happen, these new markets are going to be generated, if we can think about security as an intrinsic principle, I think we can come out of this actually more resilient and secure than we were before.
I share that optimism, both because I think it's right and because it's the only way I can sleep at night. And Mika, I was hoping to ask you to go a little bit more into the reasons why I can't, right? One of the exciting things that you're getting at, Jordan, in this period is that a lot of the new energy tech coming onto the grid is it's more digitally native. It's more software enabled. It can be updated and patched and agile against evolving threats out in the world. And we now know that that's a lot of how the bad guys get into our ecosystems, the seams between the old and the new and stuff that can't be updated. And so there's great potential for a lot of this dynamic new tech to serve a hardening and defensibility purpose. But they need to know about that potential to be able to achieve it. And we find that a lot of times the young, dynamic, very optimistic and idealistic folks who are necessary to bring that technology and vision into the space also don't spend all their time thinking about the bad news, about how their work can help temper that. So, Mika, when you were the lead cyber civilian at the Pentagon, tell us a bit more about why operators in the People's Liberation Army and elsewhere were looking at our grid. Tell us a bit more about intent, why 2027 is on everyone's mind, and Volt Typhoon on everyone's tongue.
Yeah, so we've seen for decades the PRC stealing intellectual property out of U.S. defense contractors, U.S. companies, and questions about whether or not they're using that to fuel their own technological rise or for some other purpose. But it does mean that they have a deep understanding of how U.S. technology works, and we've seen similar products to U.S. products showing up in their marketplace. Along with that intellectual property theft, which we've observed over time, is that we've seen this type of attempts to exploit vulnerabilities in the system. And so you see, as in the case of the Volt Typhoon examples, we've seen PRC actors using stolen credentials to be able to masquerade as legitimate users on the system to be able to manipulate systems. That's a very difficult technique to detect because it looks like normal activity on your network. And it's moving beyond sort of the old techniques that we had seen where people would sneak in and exploit a vulnerability and implant malware to be able to do something that the attacker wanted to do. But then there's a third set of vulnerabilities that I think we're quite worried about, which is the idea of the engineered-in vulnerability, right? Someone who builds that small exhaust port just above the main port that is a critical vulnerability in your entire system. And what is it when all of this technology is coming from China that may have been coerced by the government to be put into that system? How well do we understand those supply chains and whether or not there's vulnerabilities in some of those products? Now, not every product is going to have that type of connectivity where there is a risk to it, right? And not all that connectivity may be deliberately engineered in. What we saw just before I joined the Pentagon was we saw some Russian actors, for example, taking over a developer update channel in some enterprise software to be able to push their malware into a system and be able to try and control enterprises through that. So where product retains that developer update channel, that is a potential for liability or vulnerability depending on how well that is defended and whether or not those companies are truly at arm's length from their government, or in the case of state-owned enterprises or others, can be coerced into providing some kind of clandestine access for future use. Now, obviously, that poses a real economic risk because your products aren't trustworthy, your customers aren't going to want to buy them. But we assume that this would be a very in extremis type of exploitation.
Yeah, and maybe just a couple other things to add to that. Sort of the way that we're characterizing threats given all this change and what we hear from outlets in the government is state actors like PRC, I mean, they're looking at energy as a target and trying to essentially create preposition access so that they can have effects at a time of their choosing, using energy as a way to shape a conflict. I mean, we're seeing this play out right now, Strait of Hormuz, right? The bombing that's happening right now. Energy is being used as a leverage point, right? And so the things that we're really planning for and the threats that we're really trying to prioritize some of the research on is that notion of preposition access. And using that not just to make noise or cause more entropy, but really to have a very specific effect to shape a conflict. And so for us, supply chain, that's a big risk for us, right now when we're looking at it, and that problem is becoming less tractable, not more, as you see more technology, being integrated at the grid edge. We were just, someone was talking about grid enhancing technologies in the last panel, right? We're looking at software-defined, data-driven, right, communication-based systems as a necessary component to eke out another 15%, capacity in our transmission infrastructure. That's not a negotiable thing. We can't put enough steel in the ground fast enough, so we have to be able to use advanced controls, communications to do that. Flexible loads, right, as well. All of these things get to additional technologies that are really being adopted faster than we really have the ability to really understand what that risk is. So, for our perspective on the threat side, it's this kind of assumption of preposition access as a way to use energy to shape a conflict are things that we're really trying to get ahead of, not just from how do we go out and find those things, but doing so in a way that we can get ahead of these problems because we can't go out and analyze every single device that exists out there, every product that comes from, not even just a US-based company, but a foreign company. We just don't have those sorts of resources. And so really looking at the problem at the source and figuring out what are ways to manage that risk, not eliminate it, because we know we can't do that.
And just to build on that, I think one of the challenges that we really see is whether or not the original equipment manufacturers are doing rigorous quality assurance testing, right? If you have a product and you are very specific about what you want that product to do, and then it starts when you put it in the field behaving in ways that are strange, right? It is one of those things where you're going to want to pull that thread to figure out what is going on in the products that you are working with, because what we've seen in cyber is that very small differences in performance when you pull the thread can reveal exploitation and vulnerability. For those of you who are familiar with the classic work on cybersecurity, the cuckoo's egg, right? Somebody who saw a couple cents difference in server time pulled the thread and discovered an Eastern European espionage ring. Like, if you have very strong understanding of how your product is supposed to behave and it is not behaving in that way, that's a sign to pull the thread on it.
And to put a tangible point on that, the big example that was discovered and disclosed by Microsoft a few years ago and further corroborated by declassified testimonies to Congress across both Trump and Biden administrations was that we found PRC pre-positioning on civilian critical infrastructure, right? Critical infrastructure that didn't ostensibly have a military purpose, but that the Chinese military group that we kind of refer to as Volt Typhoon, its code name, was nonetheless preparing to disrupt, right? And the intelligence community's takeaway there was that this was, as Jordan mentioned, pre-positioning ahead of a conflict. To cut through the legalese of the declassified documents, basically, before invading Taiwan, China wanted the ability to turn off the lights in enough American cities to, one, stymie our ability to mobilize a rescue mission, and two, terrorize and disrupt society so that we did not have the political capital to sustain a rescue mission. And it really puts things into stark relief when we get into the nuts and bolts of intent and what that means and could look like, and how much of our civilian infrastructure has those capabilities sitting on it.
Yeah, and I think one thing to take away here is it's private sector infrastructure that we're talking about here that's on the front lines, right, essentially, right, to defend themselves against these state actors who are looking to use energy as a leverage point. And when you look at the private sector, right, and the way the markets are done, obviously the conversations about affordability right now, all of the stakeholders, not just utilities, right, everyone shares in this kind of collective cybersecurity responsibility. But the sector, we talked a little bit about regulations and standards in previous panels, same in cyber. The stakeholders are very unevenly resourced. There's a non-uniform way in which we look at and prioritize cybersecurity. And so it's just a very fragmented environment that makes it very difficult, not only just for us to ask the right questions and understand the risk, but then go the step further to say, these are the things that we have to be doing, right, from a prioritization standpoint, because we know energy is a thin, razor thin margin industry. We have to understand where to put our first dollar that makes the most difference. And we're having this conversation at the same time. Utilities are having conversations about undergrounding a line, for example, because of wildfire risk or something else. And so I think a lot of this gets to, we understand the intent. The question becomes is, of the things we've seen and on the vulnerability side of devices, are those vulnerabilities exploitable? And if they are exploited, what are the second, third, fourth order effects that make it such that the sector has to rally around this from an investment perspective?
Yeah, and that's one of the things I think that's really important about the engineering around this is that we have to really think about resilience, because finding and patching every vulnerability may be really hard, right? The defender has to be right.
Impossible.
Right, the defender has to be right 100% of the time, the attacker only has to be right once. And so there is this piece of this that is really about the resilience of the victim and their ability to take a disruption and keep on trucking. And this is something that we saw at the beginning of my tenure in the Defense Department. You guys may all be familiar with the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident. And what we saw there is the attackers got into the business enterprise systems with ransomware, but the victim was so concerned that they had jumped over to the OT side that the victim itself shut down the operating technology systems that kept the pipelines flowing and caused this massive energy disruption that caused huge panic throughout the southeastern United States. If companies understood how their networks were engineered, if they understood how, what their primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency plans were, so that they said, okay, this system is disrupted, I'm moving on to the next one, and here we go, and they were focused on keeping things operational, we would see a very different response from victims, and then the attacker's intent of disruption wouldn't be successful. That's something that we saw the Ukrainians demonstrate to tremendous effect at the outset of the Russian-Ukraine conflict, where the Russians were able to cyber disrupt their telecommunications infrastructure with a hack against Viasat, which put Ukrainian strategic communications down for 9 days. And yet they were still able to fight through that because their will to fight, their resilience, their ability to rely on backup systems were stronger than falling apart over that one disruption. And that is a place where when we think about electrification of the grid, trying to be able to manage all of these things remotely, we do need to think about where is the technical vulnerability that we can mitigate with humans in the loop, and how do we think about ensuring that that's still an option for us in the face of that disruption?
Yeah, I was just going to really tap into the resilience piece, and I think that's maybe one of the areas where I think, given all the changes we're seeing in energy, I think some of this new energy technology, especially some of the stuff that we see distributed, can help enable some of that resilience at the edge, right? Getting back to the consequence side of this is if we can enable stakeholders, either it's people, a military base, a national security function, have some of their own resilience through some of this technology, it takes a little bit of pressure, right, off the utilities. It gives them time to do things right. And that's where I think exploiting some of this technology that we're seeing come out, inverter-based resources at the edge, right, controllable loads, providing that ability to enable resilience, right, by these stakeholders, I think not only is an opportunity, but if we can show, right, to our nation state actors that, hey, the effect that you're looking for, right, the societal panic that you want to incite, whatever it is, it's not going to work because we have enabled resilience, right, through this technology, right, at the edge. And I think that's one area that we should be thinking about investments and prioritizing investments, not just how do we remove the cyber risk, but how do we limit the consequences of that risk? And if we can get there, right, through cyber being an enabler of that technology, that's a point to where I think, China and others might look at this and say, it's not really worth my time and effort trying to go after energy because I'm not going to get, right, the benefits that I think I'm going to get out of it.
You may have noticed that we've transitioned from the bad news part of the conversation to the good news part.
I'm the half full. I'm the half full guy.
Indeed, that's right.
Yeah.
And indeed, in cyber world, in the dour, dark areas of cyber policy, we often would lament the fact that there was not enough attention and capital being pointed at the critical infrastructure sectors that were being targeted by actors like the People's Liberation Army. But what do you know? We are now sitting in a moment where one of our critical infrastructure sectors, the electricity ecosystem, has all the attention, has all the capital, has all of the dynamism to imagine a better world. And so we have synergies and possible golden opportunities here to build the infrastructure we wish we saw. The kind of smarter, self-healing, more distributed kind of grid that can work together as a whole when it needs to, but then fail gracefully into nodes of mutual support when it has to, when it faces these kinds of concerns. And that requires very smart, digitally enabled, software orchestrated electrons, which is not something we have previously done in large quantities.
Yeah, I think Maybe if I boil that down to one particular set of technologies, what I think is critical here that's unlocking a lot of this flexibility that you're talking about, and it's really switch mode power converters, right? And so those are either the inverters that you might see for a solar site, a converter from a wind turbine, the double inline uninterruptible power supply that sits in front of a large gigawatt data center. It's really about these converters, right, that all of them, right, that kind of sit at the interface to the larger grid. They're inherently software defined. And so with that, it provides all of this flexibility to manage a system when we have all of this very steep increase in electricity demand happening right before our eyes. It allows us to use that flexibility to manage, right, a grid that has less reserve margin than we did before. And again, there was a lot of work that was done to have that that capacity margin necessary to kind of ride through some of these N-3 contingencies that we might plan for. But given the constraints that we're seeing right now, we're going to see more and more of this technology, go out there, right? Not just because we like the flexibility, but because we have to have it. Because if we don't have it, because we can't build infrastructure fast enough, we're just not going to meet our demands. And so I think there's a lot there that we could, maybe peel off in another conversation. But that's one, I think, key piece of technology from a cyber perspective that we're really focusing on.
Absolutely, and Mika mentioned earlier supply chain risk considerations being a fly in the ointment here, that we have these tremendous opportunities here with these advanced technologies to make our grid so much more resilient and hardened against hacker or hurricane, right? But if we're sourcing all of it from a country that is trying to exploit it, we're setting up some conflicting incentives there. But we don't have to boil the ocean on that, right? Like the F-35 fighter jet does not have 0 Chinese-made components. But the Defense Industrial Base makes a risk-informed cut line above which they say, this is what we're going to worry about. This is what we're going to focus in on. And below which they say, if I need to get some avionic screws from the PRC, I have controlled risk over here, so I can create a permission structure for myself over here. Where is risk concentrating in in this tech stack that we're deploying now that we should focus on? And then Mika, would love your thoughts on the governance gap in actually addressing those priorities.
Yeah, I think specifically from a cyber risk perspective, I don't know, maybe a quick philosophical note is it's really hard to decouple cyber risk from just energy risk. When we're trying to understand, how big of a hammer do we swing against this next supply chain vulnerability on a very critical piece of infrastructure that either sits inside of a substation or it sits somewhere else, we really have to contextualize that around that technology's role in the energy system and what we believe the consequences could be. And I'm not just talking about an acute outage on the grid, but how long could those outages persist, and what are the, with energy kind of being a super critical infrastructure, what are the other knock-on effects? And that's, I think, one thing that we're really trying to get after to better understand the cyber risk, because there's lots of risk. Everything's vulnerable. It's a very big space, but kind of separating the signal from the noise is the really critical piece, and a lot of that gets back to better understanding what we believe the consequences might be of that. And so we're spending a lot of time trying to understand that. And then the flip side of it, and this really isn't security, but I think it's worth mentioning, is this technology is advancing and deploying so rapidly, it is challenging our ability as the folks who are trying to defend the grid, right, to understand where do we put our resources first. But also keep in mind, if you're on the flip side of that, and you're looking at targeting energy for specific purposes, you're also introducing more entropy into their ability to have confidence that their offensive capabilities are going to have, right, the effect that they're looking for. So, I mean, it's a really uncertain environment all the way around. And so that was a long-winded way to not answer your question. Just say we're doing our best to understand where the risk is. But again, right now, in this point in time, it's very hard to put a finger on it right now because there's just so much happening so quickly. And we know that one small change can have a very widespread effect that we just haven't fully reconciled yet.
Yeah, Harry, I think part of the challenge here is there are a lot of people who I think want to be able to say there's zero risk. It is secure, full stop, right? And the problem that we have is that as we look at the two kinds of risk, the engineered in risk that we are worried about from the supply chain perspective, we're also not paying enough attention to the aftermarket risk and the idea that a lot of cyber actors take the technology world as it comes and look for vulnerabilities in this. Like our UK colleagues had done a decade ago an assessment of Huawei technology. Now I know that telecommunications are not grid, but they were looking for potential vulnerabilities, and what they said was they couldn't find any engineered in vulnerabilities, but they did find a number of ways in which the products were vulnerable. Both US and Chinese products are going to have vulnerabilities in them. We are not doing any kind of security testing to make sure that we understand what those vulnerabilities are as products roll off the line. There's no way for a large enterprise owner to understand the relative risk of a Chinese product that might be cheaper and more efficient versus a US product that may be built in an environment where we don't have this kind of pressure on the government to cooperate with potential government aims for disruption. But both products may have vulnerabilities in them that could be exploited by a third-party actor like Iran when push comes to shove. And so I think that there are these questions in terms of governance, of understanding from a customer perspective, what is in fact my risk here as I'm looking at both Chinese and US products, because we don't actually know for sure that the Chinese are trying to engineer these products in. We worry about it because of their intent, but I don't think that we've seen actual evidence of directives from the PRC saying to particular companies, put in this back door for us. We've not seen, as we've seen in the cyber world, the directive that says you must share the vulnerabilities with us first. We've seen that in cyber. I don't think that we've seen that in energy, though if someone has seen otherwise, please correct me. I would be very interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, pulling the thread on a couple things. One, on the supply chain piece, it's just incredibly challenging to even unravel, right? It is a very complicated thing just to say, here's a company that makes this device, but that device is really a system of systems. There's actually 7 companies that make up this one device, call it an inverter, maybe. And each one of those companies might on paper look like a US-based company, but actually it's a subsidiary of another company in another country. And then that's just the provenance of like the business, right? Let alone the hardware and software. Some of it open source, right? Some of it closed source. And so it's the supply chain problem is really challenging. I think there's some AI things that are going to help us get ahead of that. But the last piece is like on the telecommunications side. You're right, that's not energy. But if there's one thing we've seen from Salt Typhoon is that telecommunications is incredibly important to the operations of energy. And through Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon, we've seen how risk in the telecommunications sector can be inherited for energy. So these things aren't even clearly decoupled problems anymore.
One of my favorite examples of this just extremely complex dynamic has been these occurrences of undocumented antennas continuing to pop up in various parts of our infrastructure, which, to Mika's point, like we're pretty sure are not intentionally inserted there because that would, one, be extremely escalatory, and two, be bad for that company's business. But it's clear that this is probably a couple manufacturing line managers in Shenzhen are operating like, these are the inverters with no antennas, and these are the inverters with antennas, and that antenna is like 5 cents, and I'm doing a lot of effort to run the spreadsheet to keep them separate. I'm just going to start selling only inverters with antennas and not change any documentation. And so then all of a sudden we end up with port cranes and solar racks and a bunch of industrial items with antennas that no one has in their documentation, and may not be nefarious, but is a Chekhov's gun on the wall that might be too irresistible to look at.
Yeah, and I think that there's also risk in that, in the sort of way that the supply chain is globally integrated, in that cyber actors who choose to disrupt that way, if those products are actually globally universal, you might wind up having a rebound and unintentionally broad effect if you choose that disruption, right? We saw the Russians, for example, try to harm just Ukraine by using this Ukrainian tax software and sort of then going through and trying to encrypt systems with this NotPetya attack. And what they wound up doing is rebounding against a whole bunch of Russian oligarchs who did business with Ukraine, and some very important people in Russia were very upset about that. But it was a sort of spillover, uncontrolled effect that as we look at potentially in the global supply chain, and we see these products both in the US and in China and around the world, like what is the risk to disruption? Could it be a much bigger global effect and less targeted?
So we're going to take a question or two from the audience here in a moment, but as we transition, what can the folks in this room here today, working in energy and energy policy, deployment, resilience, if they're a benevolent hyperscaler building out the grid of tomorrow, what can they do to help get their arms around this this giant issue, recognizing knowing is half the battle?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start with, and this is the very easy answer, but I really believe it's one of the most important things, is we have to talk. I think first is accepting that, yes, cyber can and has been, right, something that has represented a very large risk, right, to energy reliability in the future, especially given the software-defined nature of things moving forward. But because of that fragmented, non-uniform nature, where all of these stakeholders are now having different roles in grid reliability. It's not just based on utilities and the RTOs and your typical stakeholders anymore. We have to have a place where people can come to the table and talk about these changes in understanding that cybersecurity, let's not repeat our sins from the past, right? And just continue to deploy this technology without thinking about cybersecurity. We mentioned supply chain. All of these things are incredibly challenging and difficult if you try to bolt on later. And the cheapest, easiest way to manage the risk is to bake it in from the beginning. And so we have to have a place to do that. We don't have that currently. There's not a table, not the subsector coordinating councils, right? This doesn't exist, in government, where you have all the stakeholders who are actually going out, deploying this technology, right? Some of this stuff being deployed with just, a few lines of code being pushed, right? There's not a table where everyone has that ability to come to the table and have that shared responsibility for cyber and that conversation. So I think it starts there, like first and foremost.
Yeah, and it's actually very frustrating from that perspective, the lack of a shared table, because I think we had seen those types of collaboration mechanisms building, convened by government, right? The CISA's Joint Cyber Defense Collaboration Center, the NSA's Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, where companies could come to the table and share threat information with government so that we were all talking about the same thing, so that we understood when I see this code and you see this code, it is in fact the same thing and not something different. We could share, the government could share what it saw in its sort of ability to see things out in the world with what people were seeing domestically, which the government is not supposed to be looking at. Part of the challenge here is that the Department of Defense, which when I left it was still the Department of Defense, it has tremendous capability to see cyber vulnerability out there in the world, but its mission is not actually one of focusing on the critical infrastructure threats. It focuses on other types of threats, to military systems, to communications networks, but it doesn't have that expertise because largely we're talking about...
Or authority.
Or authority, because it's inside the United States. So they don't have the technical expertise that's necessary to really understand where that develops. And CISA, unfortunately, is caught up in a lot of other budget mess and chaos right now, which I won't ask my co-panelists to comment on, but we're seeing a lapse in sharing authorities. We're seeing real decimation of expertise walking out the door there that had those relationships with industry. And we really do need to get back to a place where we can collaboratively work on these threats, especially as we're seeing in the Middle East today, an increasing rise in the threat. And so it's urgent that we are getting together to have that conversation.
So go home to your home organizations and be annoying about this. Ask everyone about it, ask them what they're doing about it, and what the plan is, because we might need a bottom-up building of the table to help out with the difficulties from the top down. With that, we will take a question or two. How should we go about doing that, Mr. Daniel?
Yeah, we have time for one, maybe two questions, depending on how long they take to answer. And I know I sound like a broken record, but if there are any students in the room, we will prioritize your question first. Hey, look at that. That was not a plan.
All right, so I kind of have an open-ended question here, but basically going back to the points that you made about supply chain, what are your kind of current recommendations about current manufacturing companies and energy companies navigating the volatility of the current landscape of the supply chain?
I don't have a silver bullet for anybody here. The supply chain problem's a tough one. I think the thing that we're trying to work with utility and other stakeholders on is, putting in procurement language, for example, questions about, what sort of, mitigations are these vendors putting into their products? Are there particular standards, right, that they're subscribing to? Hopefully here soon, UL is going to actually codify a cybersecurity standard for equipment. It's, by the way, a certification standard does not say that this device is secure when it comes off the line, right? No device is perfectly secure when it comes off the line, right? Everything's vulnerable. But it at least says, is this company doing its due diligence, right? When it goes out, does it require the owner or operator to change the default password? Does it have baked-in credentials, right? There's lots of things, secure coding practices, things like that. So when you're procuring equipment, starting to ask those questions and actually putting that in procurement documentation, I think is a good start. The flip side of that is, for the energy sector stakeholders here, just assume that your system's compromised. Have a very good PACE plan, an incident response plan, for not an if but a when situation. And I think you'll find that, when we're talking about cybersecurity risk, it's really hard to quantify. Cyber doesn't follow the laws of physics, right? It's really hard to quantify it, and the best defense you can have is a really good plan to how to respond and recover, because minimizing the consequences goes a long way to minimizing the risk.
And I'll just add a non-engineer observation that the smarter the component, perhaps more the scrutiny.
All right, I think we have time for one final question. One final question.
This is more just a comment. We've just spent quite a long time talking about the vulnerability of the grid and other things to cyber attacks. We should not forget that the grid is also physically highly vulnerable. All we have to do is think back to the Metcalf attack and things like that. And unfortunately, physical vulnerability often gets lost because sexy fiber security gets in the way.
In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, with cybersecurity being sexy, right?
Yeah, I do think that, right, as we look at physical vulnerability, at least in the United States, there's so much more of this physical vulnerability that goes to natural disaster than we worry about, as we see in the Middle East, of man-made kinetic vulnerability. But it is a really important question on physical vulnerability of the grid and associated technology when you're looking at places like Europe, the Middle East, Asia. I was in Lithuania with a bunch of Ukrainians, and we were touring a data center, and the Ukrainians were horrified that this data center was above ground and in a building. And they were like, why would you put this here instead of burying it deep underground? Because this is within the range of Russian missiles. And people were like, oh, right. We can't just put these things in non-hardened spaces. But we are, as the world becomes much more chaotic, we are going to need to think differently about the physical emplacement of the infrastructure that we have, and not just about its cyber vulnerability.
Yeah, and I think the physical security question, I think, is a big one, especially if we're talking about long lead time equipment, right? If we're talking about a very large power transformer, right, 200 MVA and above, the supply, the lead time for those is incredibly long. There's very limited number of manufacturers, even globally, that make those transformers, right? So I think certainly physical, and honestly, physical and cybersecurity are coupled. It's hard to decouple those as well. But yeah, certainly from a physical security standpoint, there's specific equipment and infrastructure that I think already has been well understood for a while, and there's been that's the key. Is I think we've admired the problem there, and the money hasn't been there. For example, how am I going to put up this concrete wall to prevent a 50 cal, right, from hitting my oil tank on a transformer, right?
And I think the hope would be that as we think about modern resilience and what it means to take a licking and keep on ticking, will apply across all kinds of threats beyond, uniting cyber and physical security concerns. And we're going to need everyone's help to realize that future. Everyone in this room and all of your colleagues and future scholarly agendas. It is going to be an all hands on deck across society kind of challenge for us to be able to do it. And it is gatherings like this that are going to make it more likely. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Mika. And please enjoy the rest of the conference.